Let's now focus in on China, Christian persecution in China. Stephen W. Mosher is here as the author of The Devil and Communist China, From Mao Down to Xi. Mr. Mosher, great to talk to you again, sir. How are you?
It's good to talk to you this morning.
What does Christian persecution look like in China?
Well, it looks like it has looked like since the beginning of the communist movement in China. They have been killing Christians from the very beginning. Underlying all of the pretensions of communism in China and Russia was a hatred of God. And of course, Christians are exemplars of God's presence on earth, and they have always been targeted by the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, the first martyrs to communism go back to the late 1920s when Mao's guerrillas were killing them, interrupting church services and dragging out missionaries, dragging out Christian pastors and priests, and holding mock trials and killing them, death by 1,000 cuts, beheading them, and so forth. And that persecution goes on today. It's not quite as graphic in most cases because we're not allowed to see what the Chinese Communist Party is doing. But there are 10 bishops in China, Catholic bishops, who have been in prison, in solitary confinement now for years and in some cases decades. There's ongoing persecutions of Christians throughout the country, especially in places like Wenzhou, which has had a large Christian presence for a couple of centuries now. They're tearing down crosses off churches, tearing down home churches, preventing people from meeting in their own homes to hold any kind of prayer meeting. Everything is registered, monitored, controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. And if you step outside of those narrow bounds, you're going to be arrested and sent to prison.
And the last thing you said is actually my next question. Excuse my ignorance on this, but I'll hear from time to time stories of the communists coming in and tearing down a church. And I think, well, how was that church ever allowed to be there? Like, how was there ever even a church there? How does that happen?
Well, there are cycles in China. There are cycles of repression and followed by cycles of relaxation. It's not that the Chinese Communist Party ever changes its basic attitude towards the church. It's just that it embarks upon one political campaign after another. And if the Communist Party apparatus is intent upon persecuting, for example, Tibetans today, it may leave Christians alone for a while, and maybe it targets Christians tomorrow, and maybe the day after that they target the Uyghurs in the far west, or they target entrepreneurs or other groups that they think are opposed to the Chinese Communist Party. It is a relentless series of campaigns. The Chinese Communist Party is always holding one political campaign or another to maintain the muscular tone of the system, you see. The minions have to be trained and retrained to enforce the rules of the Chinese Communist Party. So sometimes they target one group, sometimes they target another. For a long time, they targeted pregnant women under the one-child policy, and they dragged off millions of those each year for forced abortions and forced sterilizations. That campaign has now ended because China is literally aging and dying, losing population from year to year. That's another accomplishment, quote unquote, of the Chinese Communist Party, killing off the Chinese people to the point where China is no longer the most populous country in the world, but now is in second place to India, and its population is falling. But that's what happened. You have these what are called high tides in Chinese Gaochao, where the Communist Party targets different groups, and now they're targeting Christians very intensely. You're not allowed to hold a prayer meeting in your own home. At Christmas time, this last Christmas, just a couple of weeks ago, that Christian pastors were not allowed to hold church services on Christmas Eve or on Christmas Day. They're only allowed to hold their Sunday services during a certain period of time. They're required to let the Communist Party know who's going to be attending those services. They're not allowed to invite other people outside the formal listed registered congregation to their church services. So the controls are tightening. The walls are closing in on believers in China. And I think it's an expression of the fact that the Chinese Communist Party is losing its grip on the people. It is widely hated. If you look at what's happening in Iran, the same thing could easily happen in China. Why? Because the robust export sector of the economy in China is shutting down. Tens of millions of workers in the coastal cities have had to go back to their villages. They have no land to farm, no place to live, no means of support. And the Communist Party is right now mobilizing its 1.1 million members of the internal security force, and they're practicing crowd control, riot control. They're practicing for the demonstrations they anticipate will break out following what's happening in Iran and what's happening in Venezuela. So
Amazing.
I think the crackdown is coming, and Christians will be on the front lines of those crackdowns. Remember that the Catholic villages in China, the Christian neighborhoods in China resisted communism. They were in response, they were retaliated against by being especially targeted by the Chinese Communist Party. There were in the 30s and 40s massacres of entire Christian villages and Catholic villages in China. I'm writing about some in my latest book, The Church in China. Those episodes could easily happen again. I was visiting China a few years ago, and I visited a village in China which has been Christian for about 2 centuries, thanks to the early missionaries who went there. And they told me that because they were able to stick together during periods of persecution, they had been able to survive. But they always worried about the Chinese Communist Party coming in, the men with the guns coming in, and arresting and persecuting them. They are not allowed, if you're a Christian in China, you're not allowed to join the military. I asked them why. They said, well, because the Communist Party doesn't trust us with guns. And the Communist Party is probably right not to trust them with guns.
Whoa.
Anyway, I
Wow.
see.
Well, let me ask you this, because this ties in. What is the most incompatible thing between communism and Christianity in China?
Well, the most incompatible thing is the claim of communism to be a total ideology. It wants to control the hearts and minds and the souls. It doesn't acknowledge the soul, of course, but it wants to control the very being of the Chinese people. It wants to control not just how they act, it wants to control how they think and what they believe. It has its own version of what life on Earth should be, and it has its own version of its own history. It has its own version of its own ideology, where we're going to create heaven on earth. And any ideas that about a future life are anathema to that view. Of course, their history is fabricated. Their ideology is a fabrication. It's a pretense. But nonetheless, they want everyone to believe. Communism at one level is a kind of cult. And the almost 100 million members of the Chinese Communist Party are members, whether they believe or not, of this cult. Many of them join for personal advancement, of course, not because they believe in the myth that the government is one day going to fade away and everyone will be equal, but because they achieve personal advantage from joining the Communist Party. But believers can't be manipulated.
I read 90 seconds if I may ask this question, because I'm reading about Bonhoeffer and talking about how the Nazis would infuse their own ideology inside of the church, right? And you weren't allowed to say certain things. You couldn't talk about the Jews, and we're going to change this name to this name and all this stuff. Right? Does the communists do that with the Bible and with the churches? They infuse their communism into Christianity?
Yeah, you could, during the Nazi era, you could see churches where the altars had been draped with a Nazi flag, with a swastika. In China, you can see virtually the same thing. You can see pictures of Christ and the pictures of the saints being taken down and replaced with who? Pictures of Mao Zedong, the greatest mass murderer in human history. On the left side of the altar, on the right side of the altar, you see Xi Jinping, the current descendant of the first Red Emperor, who is equally brutal in his repression of Christians in China. And you can see a new Bible developed by the Chinese Communist Party, which takes out the book of Revelation and takes out sections which refer to the afterlife and focuses on the here and now. You can see homilies, you can see preachers preaching from their pulpits drafts of sermons that were given to them by the Chinese Communist Party and punished if they deviate from that. Now, there are a lot of people in China who won't go along with that, but if you don't, you run the risk of being arrested and punished. So, yes, in the same way the Nazis tried to control the church, the Chinese Communist Party is even more meticulous in trying to control what believers pray inside their own churches.
Amazing. Stephen W. Mosher, The Devil in Communist China, From Mao Down to Xi. When does your new book come out, sir?
Well, I'm still writing it, so the end of the year.
Good. Look forward to that.
In
Mr.
China.
Mosher, appreciate your time. So where can people follow you and learn more about you and your writing?
Well, we're at pop.org, pop.org. That stands for Population Research Institute, which I'm the director of.
Wonderful. Stephen Mosher, thank you for your time, sir, very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate you. When we come back, we'll bring it to America now. And we'll talk about, we'll go back to Ephesians 6. What does this mean? We don't fight against flesh and blood, against principalities. Like what? Like what? How are we to make sense of that? What are we to do with that? We'll talk about that next, right here on the First TV. Spread the word.